I never imagined that walking into my wife's brother's wedding would feel like stepping onto a stage where I was the joke everyone was waiting to laugh at. The opulent hall, adorned with chandeliers that scattered light across the marble floor, hummed with hushed conversations and clinking glasses. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved between round tables draped in satin, carrying trays of expensive champagne. The air smelled of roses, vanilla, and wealth. The kind of wealth that sneers at those who weren't born into it. Melissa held my hand, her grip firm, reassuring. But as we crossed the threshold, the murmur of voices dulled, replaced by subtle gasps and mocking smirks. Eyes flickered towards me, not in admiration, but in silent judgment. I could almost hear the words unspoken, but carved into their expressions. What is he doing here? I had been prepared for some level of coldness, but nothing could have readied me for what awaited at the elegantly decorated table reserved for us. Right there, in the center of the pristine white tablecloth, was my place card. Not with my name, not even with some careless misspelling or a mistakenly swapped name. No, the card read, in bold black letters, "Middle school graduate." My jaw clenched. A slow, crawling heat spread through my chest as I registered the insult. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a breeze stirring dry leaves. Suppressed laughter flickered among the guests like candlelight. Some pretended to be interested in their meals, but their sideways glances and curled lips betrayed their amusement. From across the room, my wife's brother, Brandon, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching me with an expression that was nothing short of victorious. Beside him, Camille, his soon-to-be wife, let out a barely contained giggle, whispering something to the woman next to her. I saw her lips move. I didn't have to hear the words to know they weren't kind. Melissa stiffened beside me. I felt her anger before she even spoke. "They did this on purpose," she whispered through clenched teeth. Before I could respond, Camille stepped forward, her dress glittering under the chandelier light, her perfectly curled hair bouncing with every step. She stopped just inches from me, her smile sweet, but her eyes gleamed with cruelty. "Oh dear," she cooed, tapping a manicured finger against her lips. "I didn't realize you were actually coming. I mean, we sent the invitation out of obligation, but, well, I guess you don't know how to read social cues." A few guests chuckled, their laughter sharp as daggers. Melissa's grip on my hand tightened. "Don't start, Camille," she hissed. Camille gasped dramatically. "Oh no, Melissa, I'm just worried. I mean, we all know how important appearances are at an event like this." She turned back to me, eyes brimming with mock sympathy. "And having, well, someone of your educational background here? It's just a bit awkward, isn't it?" I remained silent. Not because I was defeated, but because I was calculating. I had learned long ago that people like Camille thrived on provocation. She wanted me to react, to lash out, to prove to the crowd that I didn't belong in their world. The hall buzzed with anticipation. They were waiting for me to snap. Then, a voice, steady, calm, and cutting through the tension like a knife, spoke beside me. "Shall we terminate the contract with her company?" I turned my head slightly. Jessica, my secretary. Her expression was unreadable, her posture professional, but her words were a quiet storm. For the first time that evening, the laughter faltered. Camille's smug expression wavered, confusion flickering behind her eyes. Brandon leaned forward slightly, suddenly interested. I locked eyes with Jessica, let the moment stretch just long enough for the weight of her words to settle in the air. Then, slowly, deliberately, I nodded. The room was still. For the first time since I arrived, I was no longer the spectacle. Something shifted in Camille's eyes. She wasn't sure what just happened, but a ripple of unease passed through her carefully composed features. She opened her mouth, but before she could form a word, I turned to Melissa, my voice casual but pointed. "Let's take our seats," I said, pulling out her chair. "I wouldn't want to be late for such an important event." Melissa smirked, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Camille had wanted to humiliate me. Instead, I had just planted a seed of fear. The game had begun, and they had no idea that the player they mocked was the one holding all the cards. People like Brandon, Camille, and the rest of my wife's family had never once tried to understand me. To them, I was a man who barely made it past middle school, a person undeserving of their social circle, a stain on their pristine family image. They didn't care to know the why behind my past. They only cared about what they could see on the surface. And on the surface, I was a man who never graduated beyond middle school. What they never knew, because they never bothered to ask, was that my education hadn't ended because I was lazy, unambitious, or unworthy. No, my education had ended because I had been sick, deathly sick. I was 14 when it started. The pain in my chest would come without warning, sharp and suffocating, stealing my breath and making the world spin. The doctors found a defect in my heart, one that required immediate surgery. The procedure was complicated, expensive, and, most of all, terrifying. But the scariest part? The way my father looked at me when he found out. He didn't see a son who needed help. He saw a burden. He refused to pay for the surgery, saying it was a waste to spend money on someone who would never amount to anything. I was left to my mother's mercy, and she, bless her soul, fought for me like a lioness. She begged, borrowed, and even sold off the last of her late mother's jewelry just to make sure I got that surgery. And I did. I survived. But survival came with a price. While other kids my age were moving on to high school, I was stuck in a hospital bed, recovering from a body that had betrayed me. By the time I was strong enough to return to school, I was already too far behind. I tried to catch up. I really did. But my father made it clear he wasn't willing to support a son who had wasted so much time. Instead, he poured all his efforts into my older brother, the golden child, the one who was perfect in every way. With no financial support, no encouragement, and a body still weak from the surgery, I was forced to drop out. That was the moment I was labeled a failure. That was the moment people like Brandon, people who had never faced a true struggle in their lives, decided I was beneath them. But what they didn't know was that I never intended to stay beneath them. I worked hard. At first, it was small jobs, dishwashing, carrying crates at a warehouse, sweeping floors in a small restaurant. The kind of jobs that people like Brandon wouldn't even look at. But I took pride in them. Every shift, every exhausting hour, was a step towards something bigger. I saved every penny. I observed everything. I learned how businesses worked not from a classroom, but from experience. Then, one day, I saw an opportunity. The restaurant I worked at was struggling. Their supply chain was messy, their management worse. So I took a risk. I approached the owner with a proposition. I would organize their supply chain, streamline their purchasing process, and reduce their food waste by 30%. If I succeeded, he'd give me a share in the restaurant. The old man laughed at first, but desperation makes people open to crazy ideas. He agreed, and I didn't just succeed, I excelled. Within 6 months, the restaurant had doubled its profits. Within a year, it had expanded. And with that expansion, so did my involvement. I took what I learned and opened my own supply business, first for restaurants, then for other industries. I built my empire from the ground up. But did my wife's family ever ask? Did they ever care to know what I had accomplished? No, because to them, success only counted if it came with a college degree. If it came with titles they could parade around. They assumed I was insignificant, and I let them believe it. It wasn't just the in-laws who saw me as a failure. My own father never acknowledged my success. Even after I made a name for myself, even after I bought properties and expanded my company, he never once called to say, "I'm proud of you." But I had stopped caring. I had something better. Melissa, unlike her family, she never cared about my education or my lack of credentials. She saw me, the real me. She loved me for who I was, not for the degree I didn't have. And that love kept me grounded. But tonight, as I stood in that wedding hall, surrounded by snickering elites who thought they were better than me because of a piece of paper, I felt something stir in my chest. Not anger, not resentment, a cold, calculating patience. They thought I was a nobody. That was fine. Let them believe it. Because the best victories weren't won through anger. They were won through timing. And my time was coming. The wedding was supposed to be a joyous occasion, a grand celebration of love and family. Instead, it had turned into a spectacle, A performance where I was the punchline of their twisted little joke. The elites in attendance reveled in their cruelty, and as much as I hated to admit it, I could see the amusement in their eyes every time they looked in my direction. I had been seated at a round table near the center of the hall, my place card still glaring up at me with the bold insult, "Middle school graduate." It sat there like an accusation, a stain against the pristine white tablecloth. Melissa sat beside me, her back straight, her face unreadable, but I could feel the heat of her anger in the way her fingers gripped the stem of her wine glass. Every time someone laughed in our direction, her jaw clenched tighter. I exhaled slowly, reminding myself that these people were nothing. They were insects who only held power over those who let them. A sudden shadow loomed over me. I didn't even have to look up to know who it was. Camille's father. He was a well-known businessman, an industry giant, the kind of man who had built an empire through deals and deception. I had encountered men like him before, men who mistook arrogance for strength, who believed that wealth was the ultimate measure of intelligence. He leaned down slightly, a polite smile curving his lips, but the condescension in his eyes was impossible to miss. "Melissa," he greeted smoothly, his voice dripping with practiced charm. "I don't know why you married beneath you, but surely you understand that appearances matter?" The words were delivered with such casual cruelty that I almost laughed. Melissa, to her credit, didn't react right away. She turned her gaze toward him, her lips parting slightly as if she were considering how best to respond. But before she could speak, another voice joined in, one that I had been expecting. Brandon, the golden boy, the perfect son, the man whose only true achievement in life was being born into privilege. He sauntered over, his tuxedo immaculate, his expression carefully crafted to exude superiority. He placed a hand on his father-in-law's shoulder and shook his head, sighing as if he were truly disappointed. "You were only invited because Melissa insisted," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the surrounding tables could hear. "But to be honest, a middle school graduate at this wedding? It's embarrassing." The words settled over the crowd like a thick fog. A moment of silence. Then, a ripple of laughter. Soft at first, then louder. Melissa's hand trembled against her glass. I reached over and placed my hand over hers, a silent reassurance. I wasn't shaken. I wasn't shaken. Not even a little. These people didn't realize who they were dealing with. Melissa turned to me, her voice low but urgent. "We should leave. You don't deserve this." I smiled, because I knew what was coming next. Why would I leave? The night is just getting interesting. Brandon smirked. "See? He knows his place." Jessica, my secretary, stepped forward then, clearing her throat. "Sir," she said, her voice sharp and professional, "should I proceed with the contract termination?" The air in the room changed. Brandon frowned. "Contract? What contract?" I didn't answer. Instead, I reached into the inside pocket of my suit and pulled out a sleek, silver-trimmed business card. I held it between my fingers for a moment, then handed it to Camille's father. "You might want to check who I am before continuing this conversation," I said smoothly. Confusion flickered across his face as he accepted the card. His eyes skimmed the text. Then they widened. His face paled, his fingers tightening around the card as if it might disappear. Camille, standing beside him, tilted her head in curiosity. "What's wrong, Dad?" She reached out and snatched the card from his trembling hands. Then she read it and gasped. "Morgan Enterprises." Silence crashed over the room. I could see the exact moment recognition dawned in Camille's eyes. She stumbled back slightly, her lips parting in horror. Her father looked as though he had swallowed broken glass. I leaned back in my chair, entirely at ease. "Is something wrong?" Brandon, still confused, yanked the card from Camille's hands. He read it aloud. "CEO, this can't be real." "Oh, it's very real," I said casually. "And since your future father-in-law finds my presence so embarrassing, I'll gladly leave, along with my business partnership." The realization hit them like a freight train. Camille's father staggered back, mumbling incoherently. This must be a joke." Brandon's smirk had disappeared entirely. He looked between me and his father-in-law, panic creeping into his features. What does that mean? Jessica turned to me, her expression calm, composed. Shall I make the call, sir? I nodded. Camille's father fell to his knees. It was almost poetic. Wait, please. His voice was desperate now, the smug businessman persona shattered completely. This is all a misunderstanding. We didn't know. If we had known. I raised an eyebrow. If you had known? He swallowed thickly, shaking his head. I mean, we didn't mean anything by it. We were just mocking me. I finished for him. He flinched. Melissa, who had been silent through all of this, stepped forward then. Her voice was colder than I had ever heard it. You belittled my husband because of his education, but look at you now, begging him to save you. Brandon opened his mouth to speak, but Camille whirled on him instead. Her voice panicked. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't anyone tell me? Brandon could barely form words. The grand wedding, the perfect illusion of superiority, was crumbling before their eyes. I smirked, watching them unravel. You thought I was a nobody, but you just realized who I really am. And now, I get to watch you suffer for it. Jessica ended the call. The contract was terminated, and as I stood to leave, I savored the stunned silence that followed me out the door. The entire hall had gone still. Just moments ago, these people had been reveling in my humiliation, laughing at the man they thought was beneath them. Now, their expressions ranged from disbelief to sheer panic. Camille's father still knelt on the polished marble floor, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Camille stood frozen, her trembling hands still clutching my business card. Brandon looked like his brain had just short-circuited. His smug confidence had been wiped clean off his face, replaced by something much more satisfying, fear. I took my time standing up, adjusting the cufflinks on my tailored suit. I think we're done here, I said smoothly. Jessica, standing a few steps behind me, cleared her throat again. Sir, would you like me to finalize the contract termination immediately, or shall we give them a moment to process their loss? I tilted my head, pretending to consider it. What do you think, Jessica? She glanced down at Camille's father, then at Brandon. Her lips curved into the faintest smirk. I think they've had more than enough time. Brandon surged forward, his usual bravado reduced to desperation. Wait, just wait a damn second. I turned my gaze on him, but I didn't say anything. I wanted him to squirm. He exhaled sharply and shoved a hand through his neatly styled hair. Look, I admit it. We went too far. But you're overreacting. It was just a joke. I let out a short laugh. A joke? Brandon nodded quickly, eager to latch onto anything that might save him. Yeah, just some harmless fun. You can't seriously be ruining Camille's father's company over a joke. I sighed, slipping my hands into my pockets. See, that's the problem with people like you, Brandon. You think your actions don't have consequences. You think because you were born into wealth, you have the right to belittle others. But here's the thing. I took a step closer, watching him shrink back. I didn't ruin anything. You did. Camille made a strangled noise in her throat, finally shaking herself out of her stunned silence. She turned to her father, her voice cracking. Dad? Say something. Her father's face was ashen, his hands gripping his knees like they were the only thing keeping him upright. His lips parted, but no words came out. Camille turned back to me, her desperation growing. You can't do this. I didn't even know who you were. I mean, if I had known. I arched a brow. If you had known, what? You would have pretended to be decent? She flinched. Melissa took a step forward then, standing tall beside me. When she spoke, her voice carried the same icy edge as mine. It's funny, Camille. You and Brandon always made fun of my husband for not having a degree, but the irony is, you're the ones who were too stupid to recognize the most powerful man in this room. Camille's face turned an ugly shade of red, a mix of anger and humiliation twisting her features. Melissa, please. But Melissa wasn't interested in her excuses. You tried to humiliate my husband, and now you're getting exactly what you deserve. Brandon's father, who had been watching in horrified silence, finally spoke up. His voice was laced with controlled fury. Melissa, enough? Melissa turned to him, her expression unimpressed. Enough, she echoed. You're still my daughter, he said through gritted teeth. And I am telling you right now, either you convince your husband to reverse this, or you will no longer be welcome in this family. Melissa laughed. Actually laughed. She turned to me with a smirk. Darling, do you think we'll survive being cast out by these charming people? I smirked back. I think we'll manage. The tension in the room was suffocating. Camille's mother had started crying, and a few of the guests, who had once been entertained by my humiliation, were now hastily gathering their things, no doubt wanting to get out before the fallout began. Brandon's father clenched his jaw, then turned to me with a sneer. You think this is over? You may have money, but you'll never belong here. You'll always be an outsider. I shrugged. Maybe. But the difference between us is that I don't need to belong. I nodded to Jessica. Make the final call. Jessica stepped away, pressing her phone to her ear. Yes, terminate all agreements with the Hamilton Group. Camille's father let out a broken sound, his hands trembling as he reached for me again. Please reconsider. I'll do anything. I leaned in slightly. You already did enough. And with that, I turned on my heel and walked away, Melissa right beside me. The whispers followed us as we strode toward the exit, but I didn't need to hear them to know what they were saying. The man they had mocked, the man they had tried to break, had just walked out of their world completely untouched. And they were left to deal with the wreckage of their own arrogance. As we stepped outside, the cool night air washed over us. Melissa exhaled heavily, then turned to me with a proud smile. That was perfect. I chuckled, wrapping an arm around her waist. I told you, the night was just getting interesting. She shook her head, laughing. Camille and Brandon are probably screaming at each other right now. I smirked. Oh, without a doubt. She tilted her head, her eyes softening. Are you okay? I exhaled, glancing up at the star-filled sky. Yeah, I am. Because for the first time in a long time, I had done something I never thought I would. I had let them see my power, and it had been glorious. The wedding had been meant to celebrate the union of two elite families, a night filled with elegance, prestige, and exclusivity. But instead, it had become something else entirely, a spectacle of ruin. And the best part? They had orchestrated their own downfall. As Melissa and I stepped out of the grand hall, the echoes of gasps and frantic whispers still trailed behind us. The air outside was crisp, the night sky speckled with stars, but inside, the world of Brandon, Camille, and her family was crumbling, piece by piece. I slid my hands into my pockets, feeling the weight of the night settle into my bones. This wasn't just about some petty revenge. It was about respect. They had stripped me of my dignity the moment they labeled me middle school graduate, as if I were beneath them, as if I had no place in their world. But the irony was almost poetic. They had mocked a man who held the power to dismantle their comfortable existence with a single word. And I had. Melissa's hand found mine, her grip firm, grounding me. I can't wait to see what happens next, she murmured, a mixture of pride and satisfaction in her voice. I smirked. You won't have to wait long. Because even as we walked away, I knew the destruction was only just beginning. Inside the wedding hall, chaos had erupted. Camille's father, Lawrence Hamilton, had managed to pull himself off the floor, but the devastation in his eyes was undeniable. He clutched his phone in a death grip, dialing frantically, his voice sharp with desperation. What do you mean the contract is already canceled? He barked at whoever was on the other end. Reverse it. I don't care how, just fix it. But there was no fixing it. Morgan Enterprises wasn't just a business partner to the Hamilton Group. It was their largest partner. The partnership had sustained their company for years, keeping them afloat through economic downturns, securing them contracts they wouldn't have landed otherwise. And now? Now it was gone. The realization hit him like a freight train. We can recover, right? Camille's voice was barely above a whisper, her nails digging into her palms. She had never seen her father like this before, never witnessed the raw fear in his face. Lawrence said nothing, because deep down, he already knew the answer. Brandon stood off to the side, still clutching the business card as if staring at it long enough might change the reality it carried. His perfect world was unraveling before his eyes. The prestigious wedding, the immaculate reputation, the effortless superiority he had always held over others. It was all slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Camille turned on him suddenly, her eyes burning with blame. "Why didn't you tell me who he was?" she snapped, her voice cracking. Brandon's head jerked up, disbelief flashing across his face. "Me? Are you serious right now? You were the one who started the whole damn thing. Camille, you were the one who humiliated him first." "Oh, so now it's my fault?" she shrieked, fists clenched. Guests who had once been eager to bask in the Hamiltons' glory were now backing away, murmuring amongst themselves. Some had already started slipping out, not wanting to be associated with what was quickly becoming a sinking ship. Lawrence turned to Brandon then, his voice low and venomous. "You let that man walk into this wedding without knowing who he was?" Brandon swallowed hard. I didn't think he was anyone important." Lawrence's expression darkened. "Then you're an idiot." The words hung heavy in the air. Camille let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, great. Just great. My father's company is going to collapse, and now my husband-to-be is being called an idiot. What a perfect wedding." Her voice dripped with sarcasm, but the underlying panic was unmistakable. Brandon clenched his jaw. "We can fix this. We can." But before he could finish, Camille whirled on him. "There is no fixing this. Do you not understand? His company was the only thing keeping my father's afloat." A beat of silence. Then, as if on cue, Lawrence's phone buzzed again. His hands trembled as he looked at the screen. Another email. Another notification. Investors were pulling out. The whispers in the hall had shifted now. Before, they had been mocking. Now, they were pitying. Camille covered her face with her hands. This isn't happening." Brandon, still dazed, ran a hand down his face. "We just lost our biggest business deal over a joke." And for the first time in his life, he finally understood what real failure felt like. Meanwhile, I was enjoying a quiet, peaceful drive home with my wife. Melissa sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone, barely holding back a satisfied grin. "The wedding is already trending," she mused. "People are calling it the disaster of the year." I chuckled. "Fitting." She glanced over at me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think they'll recover from this?" I exhaled slowly, tapping my fingers against the steering wheel. "Eventually? Maybe, but not anytime soon." Melissa smirked. "Good." I reached over, lacing my fingers with hers. "You stood by me through all of it. Thank you." She squeezed my hand. "Always." And in that moment, I knew, no matter what happened, I had already won. Because power wasn't about status. It wasn't about wealth. It was about knowing your worth and making sure others did too. The Hamilton family's empire wasn't just shaken. It was crumbling. Inside the wedding hall, once a symbol of prestige and status, the atmosphere had turned suffocating. Laughter had vanished, replaced by frantic whispers and nervous glances. The people who had delighted in my humiliation mere moments ago were now desperately trying to distance themselves from what was rapidly becoming a social and financial catastrophe. Camille's father, Lawrence Hamilton, was no longer the towering businessman he had been at the beginning of the night. His phone buzzed relentlessly in his trembling hands, each notification another blow to his already fragile empire. His once proud shoulders had slumped, his carefully composed expression reduced to barely concealed dread. "This can't be happening," he muttered under his breath, his fingers fumbling over his phone screen as he checked his emails. His complexion had paled significantly. Sweat beaded along his temple. He looked like a man drowning in his own undoing. Camille stood beside him, her perfectly curled hair now looking disheveled from the way she kept running her hands through it in distress. "Dad," she prompted, her voice a high-pitched whisper. She knew something was very, very wrong. Lawrence ignored her, his eyes scanning the latest email. And then, he froze. His phone slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a quiet thud. His lips parted, But no words came out. Camille's mother, seated nearby, quickly stood and rushed to his side. What is it? What's wrong? For a long, agonizing moment, Lawrence didn't answer. Then, with a voice hollow and shaken, he whispered, "They're pulling out." The words sliced through the hall like a dagger. Camille's mother staggered back. Who's pulling out? Lawrence swallowed hard. The investors. Camille inhaled sharply. No, that can't be. Lawrence turned to his daughter then, his face gaunt. Morgan Enterprises didn't just terminate our contract. They set off a chain reaction. Camille clutched her stomach as if she had been physically struck. Lawrence pressed a hand to his forehead. They're withdrawing their investments, their support, everything. His voice cracked. We're finished. A cold silence settled over the room. The remaining guests were no longer interested in celebrating a wedding. Many of them were businessmen, investors, and socialites who understood exactly what was happening. The Hamilton Group wasn't just losing money. It was about to collapse. And just like that, the family they had once viewed as untouchable became untouchable in an entirely different way. Meanwhile, Brandon had been watching everything unfold in stunned disbelief. His world had never spiraled out of control like this before. He had been raised to believe in his own superiority, in the illusion that people like him would always have the upper hand. And yet, here he was. His prestigious future, his powerful in-laws, his golden reputation. All of it was turning to dust before his eyes. His wedding was supposed to be the beginning of a perfect life. Now, it was a nightmare unfolding in real time. And in his desperation to find someone to blame, his gaze landed on Camille. This is your fault, he suddenly snapped, his voice slicing through the tense air. Camille's head jerked up, her wide eyes locking onto him. Excuse me? Brandon took a step closer, pointing an accusing finger. You started this whole mess. You just had to humiliate him, didn't you? You just had to make it a joke? Camille's shock quickly morphed into anger. Oh, don't even try to pin this on me. You were laughing right alongside me, Brandon. I didn't think he was that powerful. Brandon shouted, his voice cracking. How was I supposed to know Melissa married someone like him? Camille threw her hands in the air. Oh, so now it's my job to research people's net worth before we mock them at our wedding? The guests around them awkwardly began inching toward the exits. No one wanted to be here anymore. Camille's father, still staring blankly at his phone, barely even reacted to the argument happening just a few feet away. His mind was still trapped in the sinking realization of his own ruin. Brandon ran a hand down his face, pacing in frustration. His future was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do about it. Camille suddenly let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. And to think, I thought I was marrying into power. Brandon snapped his gaze back to her. What's that supposed to mean? She exhaled sharply. You think I don't see it? You've never accomplished anything on your own, Brandon. You've been riding on your family name your entire life. Now look at you. A joke? Brandon's hands clenched into fists. You better watch your mouth, Camille. Camille took a step closer, her lips curling. Or what? Are you going to cry about it? Brandon's jaw tightened. At least I didn't single-handedly destroy my father-in-law's entire empire because I couldn't keep my mouth shut. Camille flinched, her face twisting in rage. And in that moment, it became painfully clear. Their marriage was over before it had even begun. Across the city, I sat comfortably in my office, sipping on a glass of bourbon as I watched the real collapse unfold. Jessica stood by the window, arms crossed, her phone buzzing with notifications. Sir, the Hamilton Group stocks have already started to plummet. They're in free fall. I smirked, swirling the drink in my hand. How poetic. Jessica nodded. Investors are pulling out fast. There's already talk of the company filing for bankruptcy if they don't recover soon. I took another slow sip. They won't recover. Melissa, lounging on the couch, looked up from her phone. You're enjoying this, aren't you? I chuckled. I'm just appreciating the beauty of consequences. She grinned, shaking her head. Brandon and Camille must be at each other's throats by now. I leaned back in my chair. Oh, without a doubt. Jessica's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen before turning to me. Looks like Camille's father is desperately trying to contact you, sir. I smirked. Let him wait. Jessica nodded and silenced the call. Melissa let out a satisfied sigh. So, what's next? I leaned forward, my fingers tapping against my glass.
Now.
I smiled. Now, we watched them burn. The collapse wasn't just financial. It was personal. Inside the grand hall, where champagne had once flowed freely and laughter had echoed through the marble corridors, chaos had taken its place. The scent of roses and vanilla no longer symbolized luxury but decay, as the reality of the Hamiltons' downfall settled over the guests like an oppressive storm cloud. Brandon and Camille were at each other's throats. The tension had escalated into full-blown disaster, their perfect wedding crumbling faster than the Hamilton empire. You ruined everything, Brandon bellowed, his face red with rage, his once polished demeanor now completely unraveled. His voice bounced off the ornate walls, startling the remaining guests who still lingered in the background. Silent spectators to a wreckage they didn't dare interrupt. Camille, who had once been the picture of elegance in her designer gown, looked utterly disheveled. Her hair, once styled to perfection, had begun to frizz at the edges, her makeup smudging under the stress of the evening. Her eyes, wild with anger, bore into Brandon's with an intensity that could have set the entire hall ablaze. I ruined everything, she spat, taking a threatening step closer to him. You stood right beside me, laughing at him. You humiliated him too. But do I see anyone pulling your family apart? Brandon's hands clenched into fists. You were the one who ran your mouth first. If you hadn't been so obsessed with putting him down, maybe we wouldn't be standing in the middle of this mess right now. Camille's lips curled in a bitter smile. Oh, right, because you're just so innocent in all this? She crossed her arms, tilting her head. Let's be real, Brandon. If you had done even a tiny bit of research on your sister's husband, we wouldn't be here. But no, you were too busy living in your delusion of superiority. Brandon scoffed. You act like you're any better. You didn't care who he was. You just wanted someone to mock so you could feel powerful. Camille's eyes burned with rage. And you went along with it because you're nothing without your family name. Silence. A flicker of hesitation crossed Brandon's face, because deep down, he knew she was right. Camille saw it too, and she laughed. A cold, bitter laugh. Oh my God, you just realized it, didn't you? Brandon's jaw tightened. Shut up, Camille. She stepped even closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. You were never anything special. You only got this far because of your father's money and influence. You never worked for anything. Brandon's nostrils flared. At least my family still has money. Yours is about to be. Slap. The sound echoed across the hall. Gasps rippled through the remaining guests. A few waiters actually stopped mid-step, their eyes darting between the two as if they had just witnessed the beginning of a real war. Camille's chest heaved, her hands still trembling from the impact. Her eyes glistened, but she held her ground. Don't you dare talk about my family. Brandon's cheek burned from the slap, but his pride burned even hotter. He took a step back, shaking his head as if he had finally seen her for what she truly was. You're unbelievable. Camille swallowed hard, blinking back the emotion threatening to spill over. Yeah? Well, I guess we both got exactly what we deserved. A tense moment passed. Then, with quiet devastation, she whispered, This marriage is over before it even started, isn't it? Brandon didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both already knew the truth. Across the room, Lawrence Hamilton was still desperately trying to fix the unfixable. His phone calls weren't being returned. His messages were being ignored. Every contact, every connection he had spent decades cultivating, was now turning its back on him. One by one, he had gone from a man who owned power to a man who lost it all in a matter of minutes. Camille's mother, once the ever-poised matriarch, had collapsed into a chair, her hand clutching her pearls like they were the only thing she had left. We'll fix this, she kept muttering, her voice fragile. We can still fix this. Lawrence turned to her, his face ashen. We're finished. Her breath hitched. No, That's not true. I just lost 3 of our biggest investors. Our stock has already started plummeting. Do you think anyone is going to come to our rescue now? Her lips trembled. We have assets. We have nothing. For the first time, she understood. Her husband wasn't just being dramatic. The life they had built, the empire they had prided themselves on was gone. She covered her mouth as a choked sob escaped. And there was nothing left to do but watch it all burn. Meanwhile, outside the hall, I was calmly enjoying the night air. Melissa stood beside me, checking her phone, while Jessica remained a few feet away, going through business updates. Melissa exhaled a deep, satisfied sigh. Well, that was even more of a disaster than I expected. I smirked, slipping my hands into my pockets. I told you it would be. She turned to face me, an amused glint in her eyes. You really planned for everything, didn't you? I tilted my head. I didn't plan their downfall. They did that themselves. She hummed, considering my words. I'm guessing Camille and Brandon are currently tearing each other apart? Jessica, still looking at her phone, smirked. Oh, they definitely are. She turned the screen toward us, showing a text from one of her sources. Camille just slapped Brandon in front of everyone. The marriage is basically over. Melissa snorted. Wow, that was fast. I chuckled. Fitting, isn't it? She looped her arm through mine. So what now? I looked up at the sky, breathing in the crisp night air.
Now,
I smiled. Now, we move forward. Because the Hamiltons had already lost, and I had already won. The moment we stepped into the sleek black car waiting outside, I let out a slow exhale, feeling the tension in my muscles unwind. The night had played out exactly as I expected. No, even better. I had walked into that wedding hall as the subject of ridicule, a man they considered unworthy of their presence, but I had walked out with my dignity intact while their entire empire collapsed. Melissa sat beside me, scrolling through her phone, barely containing her amusement. Jessica, seated across from us, remained focused on work updates, but I could tell she was enjoying the fallout in her own way. Just as I was about to speak, my phone buzzed. A familiar number flashed on the screen. Melissa's father. I smirked. And here we go. Melissa glanced over. Should I answer for you? She teased. I shook my head, pressing the accept button. I want to hear this for myself. I put the phone to my ear. Hello? A deep, furious voice blasted through the speaker. You arrogant little bastard. Melissa winced. Jessica arched a brow. I pulled the phone away from my ear slightly, but my smirk didn't waver. Nice to hear from you too, Henry. Melissa's father, Henry, had always been a man of control. He prided himself on maintaining order, projecting power, and keeping his family's image spotless. But tonight, that control was gone. You think you can just humiliate my daughter's family like this? You think you can walk into that wedding, cause chaos, and ruin an entire company as if it's some kind of game? I remained silent for a moment, letting him scream, letting him get it all out. Then, in a voice calm and deliberate, I said, Your daughter's family humiliated themselves. Silence. I could almost picture him gripping the edge of his desk, his face red with frustration. They insulted me, Henry, I continued, in front of hundreds of people. They treated me like garbage because they assumed I was beneath them. I let it go, until they decided to double down on their stupidity. They brought this on themselves. Melissa's father let out a bitter laugh. So you think you're some kind of big shot now, don't you? I leaned back into the leather seat. I don't think I am, Henry. I am. His sharp intake of breath told me I had struck a nerve. Melissa covered her mouth to hide her laughter. Jessica, ever professional, was typing something on her phone, but I could tell she was listening intently. Henry's voice came back, quieter this time, but no less furious. You just declared war on this family. Do you understand that? I tilted my head, watching the city lights blur past the car window. War. I repeated, as if the idea itself was amusing. Henry, you were never on my level to begin with. Another silence. Then, a seething. You think you can take my daughter away from me? Melissa, hearing that, grabbed the phone from my hand. Take me away? Are you serious right now? Melissa, Henry snapped, his voice hard. You need to understand. No, she cut him off. You need to understand. You watched as they mocked my husband. You let them treat him like garbage. And now that they're suffering the consequences, suddenly you want to step in? Where was this energy when Brandon and Camille were humiliating him? Henry tried to interject, but Melissa was on fire now. You're mad that he ruined them, she continued. Good. Be mad. Because I don't care. I stand with my husband. And if that means cutting you off too, so be it. The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica glanced up from her phone, impressed. I smirked, watching Melissa handle her father better than I ever could. Finally, Henry's voice came through, quieter now. You would choose him over your own family? Melissa didn't hesitate. I already did. A heavy sigh. You'll regret this, Melissa. She scoffed. No, but I think you will. Then, without waiting for another word, she hung up. The car was silent for a beat. Then, Jessica let out a low whistle. That was satisfying to watch. Melissa leaned back against the seat, closing her eyes briefly. God, I feel so good right now. I chuckled, taking her hand in mine. You were amazing. She smiled at me. You too. Jessica, still scrolling through her phone, suddenly hummed. Well, this is interesting. I arched a brow. What? She turned the phone toward us. Camille's father just made an official statement. Melissa leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Already? I took the phone and read the headline. Hamilton Group CEO addresses business collapse following terminated partnership with Morgan Enterprises. I scrolled down, scanning the article. Due to unforeseen circumstances, the Hamilton Group has lost a crucial business partnership. We acknowledge our failures and will be working towards stabilizing the company. At this time, we request privacy as we navigate this difficult period. Melissa snorted. Unforeseen circumstances? Jessica smirked. More like we messed around and found out. I chuckled, handing the phone back to her. They're trying to contain the damage, but it's too late. Jessica nodded. The stock is still dropping. Investors are pulling out by the hour. The press is all over it. Melissa stretched her arms with a satisfied sigh. So, what happens now? I exhaled, feeling a deep, satisfying sense of closure settle over me. Now? I looked at her with a small smile. Now, we move forward. Because at the end of the day, I had never needed their approval. I had built myself from the ground up, without their help, without their respect, without their validation. And now? They were the ones left begging. The Hamilton Group was collapsing, and there wasn't a damn thing they could do about it. By the time Melissa and I arrived home, I could already see the effects rippling through the media. News outlets had picked up the disaster at the wedding, framing it as the fall of a dynasty. Business analysts speculated on what went wrong, completely unaware that the root of it all had started with something as simple as a place card at a wedding. I leaned back on the couch, one arm draped over the backrest as Melissa curled up beside me, her phone open to the latest headlines. Jessica, who had followed us home for a business debrief, sat across from us, scrolling through updates with her usual air of professionalism. Camille's father is scrambling, Jessica reported, her eyes scanning an article. He's trying to stabilize the company, but it's not working. Investors are backing out faster than he can reassure them. Melissa chuckled, tucking her legs beneath her. I wonder if he's finally realizing that insulting the wrong person wasn't the smartest move. I smirked, reaching for my glass of bourbon. Probably. I took a slow sip, but realization doesn't undo the damage. Jessica's phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. Oh, this is good, she murmured, showing me the latest financial report. Hamilton Group stock drops another 30%. Analysts predict bankruptcy within months. I exhaled through my nose, setting my drink down on the glass table. They won't last months. Melissa tilted her head. You really think it's over? I turned to face her, my expression unreadable. It was over the second they mocked me. Jessica, still reading through her phone, smirked. There's also another little update. Brandon has resigned from his position at the hospital. Melissa's eyebrows shot up. Wait, what? Jessica nodded. The board didn't want to be associated with a scandal like this, especially since his name is trending for all the wrong reasons. They encouraged him to step down. Melissa covered her mouth with her hand, barely suppressing her laughter. Oh my God, he lost his job because of this? Jessica shrugged. Looks like it. I leaned back, fingers tapping against my knee. He's just the first domino. Camille is next. Melissa let out a satisfied sigh. What about Camille? She's not exactly business savvy like her father. Jessica smirked. She won't be able to maintain the lifestyle she's used to. With the Hamilton Group falling apart, her inheritance is as good as gone. She'll have to figure out how to survive without Daddy's money. Melissa grinned. So, in other words, she's screwed? Jessica nodded. Completely. The satisfaction in the room was palpable. I took another sip of my drink, relishing the moment. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. These people had built their lives on belittling others, on using their status as a weapon to cut down anyone they deemed beneath them. Now, they were learning the hard way that power isn't about titles. It's about influence. And I had plenty of it. Melissa shifted beside me, resting her head against my shoulder. Do you feel even a little bad? I turned my head slightly, meeting her gaze. Not at all. She smiled. Good. Because I don't either. Jessica's phone buzzed again, and she glanced at the screen before raising a brow. Well, this is interesting. I arched a brow. What now? Jessica smirked, tilting the phone toward me. Camille has officially filed for divorce. Melissa gasped. Are you serious? Jessica nodded. Looks like the golden couple didn't even make it through a single day of marriage. Melissa burst into laughter, covering her face. I mean, we knew it was coming, but I didn't think it would be this fast. I chuckled, shaking my head. Camille isn't the type to stick around when things get hard. She only married Brandon because she thought he'd secure her future. Now that he's unemployed and her father's company is failing, I leaned back against the couch. She's cutting her losses. Jessica hummed in agreement. She's smart in one way. She knows when to jump ship. Melissa snorted. Yeah, but where's she gonna land? It's not like rich men are lining up to marry a woman who just got publicly humiliated. I smirked. She'll learn soon enough that no one respects a sinking ship. Jessica set her phone down, stretching slightly. Well, that's the latest update. Any final moves you want to make? I considered it for a moment before shaking my head. No need. They're already destroying themselves. I don't have to do anything. Melissa sighed contently. That's the best kind of revenge, isn't it? Letting them dig their own graves. I smiled, running a hand through her hair. Exactly. Jessica stood up, adjusting her blazer. Then my job here is done. I'll keep monitoring things, but I think we can officially say the Hamilton era is over. Melissa and I watched as Jessica grabbed her things and made her way toward the door. Before she left, she turned back with a small smirk. By the way, if you ever want to ruin someone else's life, just let me know. That was fun. Melissa laughed. Noted. Once Jessica was gone, Melissa turned to me, a softness replacing the amusement in her eyes. You really did it, she murmured. I reached for her hand, lacing our fingers together. No, they did it. She smiled, tilting her head. Still, you made sure they felt it. I brushed my thumb over her knuckles. I didn't do it for revenge. She nodded. I know. I exhaled, letting the moment settle. I did it because they needed to understand something. Melissa squeezed my hand. What? I looked at her, my expression calm but firm. Respect isn't given. It's earned. And if they had learned that lesson sooner, maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't be watching their lives burn to the ground. But that wasn't my problem. The storm had passed, and I had come out of it completely unscathed. The Hamiltons? They had been reduced to a cautionary tale, a lesson in what happens when you let arrogance blind you to reality. By the next morning, the news was everywhere. The collapse of the Hamilton Group was no longer just a rumor, it was a headline. Major business analysts were tearing apart their financial mismanagement. News channels were running reports on their plummeting stock prices, and social media, it was relentless. The same people who once admired Camille's family were now mocking them. The elite circles they once belonged to had turned their backs in record time. I sat in my office, sipping on my morning coffee, while Jessica stood by the window, scrolling through her tablet. "They're done," she said, a satisfied edge to her voice. "No one wants to be associated with them anymore." I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. It was inevitable. Jessica smirked, flipping to another screen. Camille just posted a heartfelt message on her social media. "Want to hear it?" I raised a brow. "Go ahead." Jessica cleared her throat dramatically. "This year has been a difficult one. Sometimes, the people we trust the most hurt us in unimaginable ways. But I refuse to be broken. I will rise from this pain, stronger than ever." I almost choked on my coffee. Melissa, who had just walked into my office, actually burst out laughing. "Are you kidding me?" she said, shaking her head as she sat on the edge of my desk. "She's acting like she's the victim?" Jessica nodded, suppressing a smirk. "Oh, but it gets better." She followed it up with a post about embracing new beginnings. Melissa rolled her eyes. Translation: she's hoping another rich idiot will come along and save her. I set my coffee down, lacing my fingers together. She'll be waiting a long time. Her family's name is worthless now. Melissa sighed dramatically, placing a hand over her heart. "Oh no, what a tragedy." Jessica smirked. "Brandon's situation isn't much better. He's keeping a low profile, but I heard from a source that he tried reaching out to his old contacts for a new job." I arched a brow. "And?" Jessica let out a small laugh. "No one wants to hire him. He's too much of a liability. The hospital board made it clear that he was encouraged to resign to avoid bad press. And since most of his opportunities came from his father's influence," she trailed off meaningfully. Melissa grinned. "He's finally experiencing what it's like to not have everything handed to him on a silver platter." I smirked. Reality check came a little late for him. Jessica nodded. "He might recover eventually, but it'll take years. And by then, no one will care about him." Melissa leaned against my shoulder, resting her chin on my arm. "You know, I keep thinking about that night at the wedding. How they all looked at you like you were nothing." I exhaled, brushing my thumb over her hand. "I remember." She tilted her head up, meeting my gaze. "I hope they remember it too. Every single time they wonder where it all went wrong." I squeezed her hand gently. "They will. Because that's the thing about falling from power. You don't forget it. Ever." 1 week later, the dust had finally settled, and life had moved forward. Melissa and I were having dinner at one of our favorite restaurants, enjoying a rare night out away from work. The soft lighting cast a warm glow over her features, her smile bright as she sipped from her wine glass. "You know," she said, setting her glass down, "for the first time in a long time, I feel like we don't have to deal with any drama." I smirked, cutting into my steak. "Refreshing, isn't it?" She grinned. "Extremely." Just as I was about to respond, a familiar figure caught my eye from across the restaurant. I set my fork down, my expression unreadable. "Well, look who it is." Melissa followed my gaze, her brow furrowing. Then her lips parted in surprise. "Is that Camille?" It was. She was sitting alone at a small table, wearing sunglasses indoors. Probably to avoid recognition, though it wasn't working. She looked nothing like the woman from the wedding. Her hair was hastily tied back, her posture stiff, and instead of fine dining with an entourage, she was waiting tables. Melissa's eyes widened. "Oh my God, she's working here?" Jessica had mentioned that Camille would struggle to maintain her lifestyle without her family's wealth, but I hadn't expected her to fall this far this fast. At that moment, Camille turned her head slightly and spotted us. Our eyes met. For a split second, I saw it. The recognition, the humiliation. She quickly looked away, grabbed a notepad, and rushed toward a nearby table to take an order, acting as if she hadn't seen us. Melissa exhaled. "Wow." I watched Camille from a distance, my expression unreadable. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't the kind of person who took joy in seeing someone at their lowest. But this was justice. Melissa reached for my hand. "Do you regret it?" I turned to her, my gaze steady. "Not at all." She smiled. "Good." We continued our dinner, Camille nothing more than a ghost from a past I had already left behind. Later that night, as we drove home, Melissa glanced at me, her expression thoughtful. You know, everything that happened? It made me realize something. I glanced at her. What's that? She smiled softly. People like Brandon and Camille, they live their entire lives thinking status is everything. That power means treating people like dirt. But real power? She laced her fingers with mine. It's about respect. I exhaled slowly, letting her words sink in. She was right. Power isn't about being feared. It's about being respected. And those who don't understand that eventually lose everything. As I pulled into our driveway, I turned to Melissa, squeezing her hand. Come on, let's go inside. She smiled. No more drama? I chuckled. No more drama. Because we had already won. And now, we were finally moving forward.